For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. I am Surya Gangadharan. The recent summit of NATO, the Madrid summit of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, billed as the biggest in many years, was crucial for the view it took on China. The strategic concept document released at the summit underscores for the first time the challenge posed by China. I have a small graphic here that will tell you what they said in that strategic concept document. It says, China's stated ambition and coercive policies challenge our interests, security, and values. It employs a broad range of political, economic, and military tools to increase its global footprint while remaining opaque about its strategy, intentions, and military buildup. Its malicious hybrid and cyber operations target allies and harm alliance security. It seeks to control key technological and industrial sectors and strives to subvert the rules based international order. And finally, the deepening strategic partnership between China and the Russian Federation run counter to our values and interests. So, some pretty strong language there. Let me bring my guest for this evening. You met her before, Dr. Velina Tchakarova, Director of the European Institute for European and Security Policy. Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. Dr. Velina, glad to have you again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure being with you and discussing critical international issues and their relevance for India's foreign and security policy.
Great, lovely to have you again. Dr. Velina, my very first question. This is the first time NATO has designated China in adversarial terms, and largely because of its support for Russia in Ukraine. So, in practical terms, what does this amount to, this designation of China?
You correctly pointed to the fact that China is mentioned, and you quoted actually the most significant spots in the NATO concept. China is now mentioned as a systemic competitor, as obviously a systemic challenge to the NATO alliance. However, the first time it was mentioned was already at the London summit. It was, so to say, the preparation for this summit, because at this summit there was also a very important strategic document, the NATO strategic concept, that was adopted. This document is important for the NATO members because it outlines the future challenges, risks, but also the preparation in terms of interests, capabilities, areas of activities for the NATO members, and it basically sets the tone for the upcoming decade. So that's why it's very important message. Of course, mostly meant for the European NATO members that still do not perceive China as a security threat. So it was obviously a compromise between the European NATO members on the one side and the United States on the other side, as we know that the United States is already shifting its focus on the Indo-Pacific, with China being the most relevant, the most significant systemic competitor for the American interests and, of course, strategic goals. But on the other side, amid Russia's war against Ukraine, for the European NATO members, Russia remains still number one threat, security threat and challenge, which is why I think that specifically the last sentence that you also actually pointed to, namely the deepening strategic partnership between China and Russia. This is the really new element that we need to pay attention to, namely of what I've outlined as the Dragon Bear Alliance, or or let's say better set modus vivendi of strategic coordination between China and Russia in all strategic domains, and that is basically going to be the threat multiplier in the future, in my view, when it comes to the NATO.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the divide between Europe and the US. There are also divisions within Europe about China, aren't they?
Absolutely. And we've had already the occasion to outline some of these cleavages in previous interviews. So there is currently a kind of an emerging cleavage within the European NATO family, between the European NATO members. On the one side, we have the big European powers, such as France and Germany. On the other side, we have the Central Eastern European powers, such as Poland and the Baltics. And throughout the last 4 months, when Russia was waging the war against Ukraine, there was a clear dividing line between them when it comes to understanding the war, the main goals of Russia in this war. So on the one side, the big European powers like France and Germany seek actually negotiations, peace negotiations. They do believe that if some kind of ceasefire is offered to Russia, if Russian president is invited to, let's say, neutral countries such as, for instance, Austria, that is not NATO member, or maybe Switzerland, there will be a kind of a solid ground for talks, for peace talks between the Ukrainian and the Russian presidents. On the other side, however, Central Eastern European countries like Poland and Baltics do believe that the complete subjugation of Ukraine is in fact on the agenda of the Russian president, that Russia will not stop after winning, for instance, the war in the east of Ukraine. Currently, just to give you a very short overview, the whole Luhansk province is already under Russian control. This is one of the two provinces in Donbass in the east of Ukraine, and half, that means 50% of Donetsk is also under Russian control. So Russia is obviously having no intention of stopping the war as of now. So they do believe that after this critical second phase of the war, Russia will continue after a short break, will continue with a further war goals. And this cleavage within European NATO members is one that no one more or less wants to talk about or discuss for obvious reasons, because right now the Western coherent approach to Russia's war against Ukraine is the most critical issue.
Now, we had 4 countries at this Madrid summit that were attending for the first time: Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia. So, what do we draw from there, from the invitation extended to them to attend this summit?
As you mentioned, this is the first time that they actually participate at the outskirts of NATO summit. It's very important for these 4 countries to be part of the gathering during the NATO summit, in order to show first and foremost coherence in their approach when it comes to keeping China in check in the Indo-Pacific. Specifically now, after Russia's war against Ukraine, it's even more important in the sense that there are growing concerns about a similar development in the region, specifically when it comes to Beijing's position towards Taiwan. So there are shared fears among these countries when it comes to the possibility of a similar approach by China to Taiwan in, now ahead, of course, of the Congress of the Communist Party in the second half of the year, but also in the long term. So China's growing assertive position towards Taiwan, China's growing military presence in South China Sea and beyond are definitely on the agenda of these 4 nations. And the second important point is that there are animosities between Japan and South Korea. So the very fact that they haven't attended any bilateral meetings and summits for quite some time now give them the opportunity to be part of larger multilateral formats and to also try to address some of their issues in order to avoid further tensions.
Do you see them being invited in subsequent summits? I mean, if I vaguely recall, Israel attends these summits.
Well, there are many countries right now being invited to the NATO summit. There have been also a similar kind of now more or less tradition. Also, when we look at the G7, which also invited some countries from Asia, Latin America, Africa to their summits, I think here the message is very clear that NATO is going to reach out to international partners, that NATO members to seek actually to deepen international partnerships in specific corners of the world. And the Indo-Pacific, as I said, is going to be the most critical, the most important arena of global power competition from American point of view. Now, how to actually bring the European NATO members on the same page is going to be a difficult task for Washington. However, one way to do it is by inviting also other partners from the region to outline the existing threats, security threats, and also to point to the emerging new challenges in the region.
No, I noticed that New Zealand and South Korea, although they are US allies, they are not really in any Indo Pacific kind of arrangement.
Well, right now, what we are observing are various formats emerging in the region. Some of these formats are having rather military nature. Others are more with a more comprehensive program. Take, for instance, the Quad as an example, the quadrilateral format between the US, India, Japan and Australia has actually a component that entails kind of defense cooperation. For instance, there are naval exercises conducted by the Quad members, but it's not an institutionalized format. On the other side, if you take, for instance, AUKUS, this is a classic security and defense pact between the US, Australia, and the UK. So the same goes for the other countries in the region, with the growing bifurcation of the global system. That means the system is splitting into two parts, being, of course, controlled, dominated, influenced by either the United States or China. So with this growing bifurcation of the global system, that also is going to reflect the Indo-Pacific, where we are observing a similar bifurcation, whereas regional partners, regional actors will be confronted with either or choices. These are difficult choices, like the case of Australia. Australia, despite its really big geoeconomic clout with China, and its entanglement, specifically in the trade sector with China, decided actually to side with the United States. Others, like South Korea, as you said, are going to navigate carefully because, for instance, in the case of South Korea, it has very, very difficult relationship with North Korea, but it strives, of course, for to keep this relationship for the sake of the two nations. As I said, it has also a very strained relationship with Japan, and yet, of course, it's a very important ally of the United States. So this kind of oscillation of the regional actors is going to be increasingly observed in the region and beyond, while they are, trying to not get caught in a binary world between the United States and China.
Interesting. Just coming back to NATO and India, are you aware of any outreach, possibly any dialogue with India that is maybe on the cards or may have been mooted earlier?
Well, I argue that we should not put India in the same pot as all the rest of these countries, because India has always strived for a very self-reliant policy, even in the field of defense. And the first important thing is that I mean, from my personal perspective, is that, of course, the dialogue will significantly increase. That means that dialogue on bilateral level between the United States and India, but also between NATO members and India. This dialogue will increase. Whether this will result in significant breakthroughs, let's say institutionalized partnerships, alliances, whatsoever. I argue that this is still not on the horizon from my point of view. Why is it that? Because first and foremost, I think that New Delhi has been preparing for China's rise for quite some time now. Probably it's the most prepared nation to face China's assertive policies in the Indo-Pacific. On both terrains, of course, terrestrial along the line of control, but also in the Indian Ocean. Second important point is that India is en route to becoming one of the most significant, let's say, leading economic powers in this and next decade. So it will, of course, will witness a growing geo-economic cloud that goes beyond the Indo-Pacific. That means automatically for New Delhi to forge new alliances and partnerships, not only in the defense sector, but also in all relevant strategic domains. Third important point is that right now, in fact, I argue that Washington needs India more when facing the dragon bear. That means this threat multiplier coming from the modus vivendi of strategic coordination between Beijing and Moscow. Then India needs Washington when facing China in the region. That means that any further military tensions between China and India, and I'm really cautious, specifically right now in the second half of the year, ahead of the Congress of the Communist Party, whether we will not witness a new episode if Chinese hawks, surrounding Xi Jinping decide that they need a military adventure, or let's say a foreign policy success from their perspective, of course, in order to present something for the Chinese population. As we know, right now, China is struggling with economic slowdown, with the lockdowns, putting millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in the lockdowns, obviously failed COVID zero policy. So I'm really cautious whether Chinese will not, root for this option ahead of the Congress. And in this particular case, India will not rely on United States or international community or NATO, but will face China's military threat, let's say, along the line of control on its own. However, this strategic self-reliance in an interconnected world may have also disadvantages in a sense that no country right now can actually exist and operate in an isolated manner, which is why I think that New Delhi will be very creative in terms of forging its partnerships and its alliances. But I do not foresee a NATO-India alliance. I do not foresee any kind of official invitation by NATO. Let me remind you also the remarks of the Indian foreign minister in 2021, where he also pointed to the fact that he would not foresee any Asian NATO. So Asia operates in different manners. Asian nations are, of course, interlinked with each other through various, of course, fields of activity. There are many tensions and issues, conflictual issues. So here I see that it's going to be a different, specifically in this transitionary period of the international relations, going to be a different manner. It's going to be more active, more proactive position coming from NATO, probably members. Let's say in bilateral manner. For instance, France is having a very good relationship with India. Whether this will result, for instance, let's say in military exercises, I doubt it at this stage. But there will be increasingly voices from diplomats, from pundits, security pundits, experts from Washington, from the European NATO members also, when it comes to the future relationship between NATO and India. And yet, specifically because of the historical past, because of the very cautious position of India towards the West, and also because of the long-term strategic partnership with Russia, I argue that this will not be the path that India is going to seek for its relationship with the West in the future.
Do you see groups like the Quad, the AUKUS, then the I2U2 as the building blocks of a security framework sometime in the future in this part of the world?
I see that on the one hand, the importance of such formations is going to grow. They will solidify their position, their role in the region and beyond. As I said, there will be rather a non-institutionalized a way of forging partnerships. Some of them will be steered, of course, by the United States, but some will be actually will emerge out of strategic necessity because of shared threats, mostly related to the growing role of China in the Indo-Pacific, in South China Sea, and specifically the fear of China's possible military intervention against Taiwan in the future, with all the repercussions for the region and beyond. So on the one hand, there will be a growing interest on the side of Indo-Pacific nations, including India, to be part of such discussions, such debates. For instance, Quad, the quadrilateral format, is a non-institutionalized format. Mostly, it has mostly a non-defense nature, non-military nature. There are a lot of valid and relevant issues that are being discussed there, based on shared also geoeconomic interests, like reconfiguration of supply chains, creating vaccines value chains, and so on and so forth. So all of this, if you think about it, they emerge actually out of a strategic necessity to come up with common solutions to a common systemic challenge, once again centered around China. Others, like AUKUS, are interesting in a sense that, as I said, it's a traditional security and defense pact. And here, of course, the question arises whether others will join. I mean, Japan, for instance,
Yeah.
showed some certain interest, but for instance, I do not think that India would be eager to become part of security and defense pacts such as AUKUS. It will rather seek to, once again, navigate between the two emerging blocks. For India, it is first and foremost about the national interests, its own national interests. And I can give you a concrete example with the recent facilitation of the international transport corridor that goes
Yeah.
through Iran and reaches Russia.
Yeah.
Another one is the example with the Emirates, where once again it's about creating new value chains and new critical supply chains from Indian point of view. So I think that India will further oscillate, will go after its own national interests, will be part of some of these formats if it sees serious interests being covered by them, and will refrain from participating in others, specifically institutionalized security and defense alliances. Not that India will be once again a non-aligned country. As I said, it will have a very different role as an emerging global economic power. However, it will not, for instance, refrain from its security and strategic, actually, partnership with Moscow, even after the war ends. But it will depend once again on the dragon bear, how deep this modus vivendi of strategic coordination will go. Will it affect and actually impact Indian interests in the Indo-Pacific? These are questions that we cannot find an answer yet.
So, last question. India is a member of Quad. It's in part of I2U2. It's also in the BRICS. It's also in the SCO. So, there is a criticism here that we are spreading ourselves thin. We are contradicting, each other move that we make. How is it seen in your part of the world?
Well, in Europe, of course, I think that the biggest miscalculation that happened in terms of expectations, in terms of assessment, evaluation from the last 4 months was in fact not China's position. China's position on the war was more or less expected, but it was India's position. For Europe and for the West, it's still very difficult to understand, and we need to explain a lot why India has sided as it's viewed here with Russia following the war against Ukraine. Why India is still, of course, refraining from, let's say, punishing Russia or joining the Western sanctions or whatsoever. This is still very, very difficult to be understood, and it has a lot to do with the fact that, as I said, things right now are being regarded in terms of a newly emerging binary world. Either you are with us or you are against us. So there is nothing in between. But I argue that right now, in this transitionary period of the international relations, the most relevant regional actors that have have pursued self-sufficient policies that are able, of course, to oscillate, will actually strive for a kind of, it's not neutrality in a sense. It's, as you said, on the one side, India is also participating in relevant China and Russia-led formats and blocks, such is the case with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. BRICS is another important format. Why? Because India has this very, very rapidly changing geoeconomic cloud. It has also an interest to be part of these formats, to listen to the debates, to listen to what is being discussed. There are also major issues such as growing terrorism threats in Central Asia and in South Asia, spillover effects from the disastrous withdrawal of US and their NATO members from Afghanistan. So a lot of the issues are being discussed exactly within these formats, and not, for instance, within NATO and other Western formats. And for India, it has, of course, first and foremost to secure its own national interest. For Europe to understand that, I think is going to take quite some time right now, but it also has a lot to do with let's say, the shift in the understanding where Europe's role in the world will be in the future. I think that our decision makers in the European capitals struggle to understand that Europe's diminishing role in the world has a lot to do with its decreasing share in terms of global GDP, in terms of the lack of any security provider role in the world, that we are not perceived, in fact, as as a individual security provider. I mean, of course, the European Union and the members, but we are more or less an appendix to the American hard power, that the European powers have been more or less free riding on American hard power for the last 30 years, have not invested in their defense capabilities, have not invested in the defense sector. And right now we are actually realizing the damaging influence of these kind of policies, and so on and so forth. So all of this, I think, is coming together at the background of the most disastrous war that took place on the old continent since 1945. It's by far the most destructive actually war. And the second, of course, important point is that the European security order, as the European powers knew it from the last 30 years, is over, is gone. So once again, there will be, of course, the need for for recreating, for reshaping the European security order, but it will very much depend also on the success of Russia in Ukraine. If Russia is successful with its war against Ukraine, if it actually demolishes the second largest country in Europe, it will emerge as the most powerful, as the biggest European power on the old continent, and that means that the rules of the game will be reshaped by Moscow. Yes, and will significantly change. So all of this coming together means that some hard lessons need to be drawn from what was going on over the last 4 months, but even beyond that. And we are not there yet. There is no significant security debate right now when it comes to the future of the international order, when it comes to the role of Asian powers, and specifically the role of the two Asian giants, China and India, in this new global order. And of course, when it comes to the role of Europe in this global order.
Fascinating. Dr. Velina, as always, great pleasure talking to you and great insight. Thanks again very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's been, as always, great pleasure, and warm greets to the Indian audience.
And for those of you who have followed us on this conversation, thank you for subscribing to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram. Thank you and good night.